Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session on shifting power, exploring the value of pooled funds in the UK funding landscape. My name is Husna Mortuza, and I'm the Associate Director of Public Engagement at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, where I look at movement effectiveness and all things narratives and storytelling. Some of you will know Joseph Rowntree Foundation is a social change organisation working to support and speed up the transition to a more equitable and just future free from poverty where people and planet can flourish. We know that's an ambitious agenda, but we know the problems are deep and systemic. We also know that we can't do this alone, and we work in partnerships and collaboration with others. But one of the things that we identified working in this area is whilst funder collaboration is a growing trend, there is very little information and research on pooled funding. There's lots of research from the USA, but it's very difficult to understand the context in the UK. Who is doing it, how it's being done, what are the pertinent questions that we need to ask ourselves and our boards, but also what are the resources and tools needed to start that conversation. And we know many of you here will probably be doing it at different scales and different pace, but we just wanted to understand what that means. We therefore commissioned independent research consultant Alice Sachrajda and Lena Baumgartner to help us investigate this area of work. One of the things that we did is make sure we had a bit more holistic approach, and the approach they took, which you'll find a bit more in the research overview, is they interviewed funders, grantees, as well as people doing the work on the ground to better understand what's needed in this sector. I just want to say a huge thank you to the participants in this research because they were all incredibly generous with their time, insight, and wisdom. We also found that the depth of information and the resources were really helpful. And whilst initially it was an internal piece of work, we wanted to share with others to help share the knowledge and support that's needed in this sector. So we're really delighted to hear your views on this research, but also where you are and what you're doing. But for now, in terms of format for this session, we're going to hear from Alice and Lena on the research findings. They'll have about 20 minutes or so to do that. We'll then hear reflections from a funder and reflections from a funder intermediary. From a funder reflection, we've got Holly Donner, who is the Director of Strategic Learning Insight Infrastructure at the Paul Hamlin Foundation, and Martha McKenzie, who is the Executive Director of the Civic Power Fund. I'm delighted to get both of them here today so we can get a different perspectives for what it means for us, but also to give a wider perspective of how things are working on the ground. We will also have 20 minutes for Q&A, so please do use the chat functions to ask any questions, comments, or reflections. We'll be delighted to hear from them too. So for now, over to you, Lena.
Hi, and welcome everyone. We're really pleased to see so many of you here today. I think we're now at 122, which is just amazing, and sort of exceeded our expectations. I think when we first advertised this event, so it's absolutely brilliant to see the interest in pooled funds. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lena Baumgartner. I'm a freelance consultant and researcher focusing on philanthropy and effective grant making. I've been working in the sector for over 15 years. I was with New Philanthropy Capital for many years, and I was the first head of grants of the four. Since 2017, I've been freelance, and as part of my freelance portfolio, I headed the UK Democracy Fund for a year, which gave me direct experience of pooled funds. I've also had the pleasure of collaborating with Alice on numerous projects over the years, and I will now hand over to her.
Thanks, Lena. Hello, everybody. So my name is Alice Sachrajda. I work for Unbound Philanthropy, but also as a consultant. And for many years, I've worked with Comic Relief to set up a new pooled fund there called the Power of Pop Fund. So as Lena and I have both explained, we're both very passionate and interested in this area, as we've both had direct experience of either setting up or running pooled funds. So when Husna approached us and said that JRF were interested to research this area in more depth, we really jumped at the chance at this opportunity to explore more about pooled funds. So I want to just start by unpacking what we mean by the term pooled funds. If we could just go to the next slide, please. Funder collaborations sit on a really broad spectrum. So at one end, you can have quite loose forms of collaboration, such as informal sharing of knowledge or learning. And at the other, you can have, at the most aligned end, a pooled fund. So we came up with this definition, that a pooled fund is where multiple funders contribute money and delegate grant-making authority into a separate entity, the pooled fund, to advance a particular objective or strategy. So I want to just touch on the methodology. We felt that it was important that this research should look at pooled funds from all angles. So we interviewed 15 people and an even number of funders, intermediaries, and grantees who've received funding from both foundations as well as pooled funds. And we also did a focus group with a group to be able to understand a little bit more about our emerging findings. We really want to thank all of our interviewees and our focus group participants for being so generous with their time and sharing their valuable insights. And another point to note, we deliberately produced a slide share rather than a long written report, because we really wanted our findings to be accessible, and we hope that you'll be able to use this report, slide share, as a tool. And there are a number of features within it that will touch on a series of questions and tools that we hope that will be really helpful to foundation staff and boards as they engage more with this topic. So I'm going to hand over to Lena now to talk a little bit more about the context. Could we move to the next slide?
Thanks, Alice. So yeah, as we said, first point on the slide is that we feel the UK funding landscape is shifting, and over recent years, pooled funds have become a more prominent feature. Examples that you're hopefully aware of would be the Baumgartner Foundation, the UK Democracy Fund, Justice Together Initiative, the Power of Pop Fund, the Propel Fund, and the Civic Power Fund. And of course, there are many more. But relatively speaking, the volume of funding channeled through these pooled funds is still very small. That stands in contrast with the US, where pooled funds have grown to become a much more established part of the philanthropic landscape. Through our research, we got a strong sense that funders are keen to learn more about pooled funding and assess the value of pooled funds, which is what we're really hoping to help with. One question sort of on the onset that we were interested to explore further is why funders are perhaps now collaborating more than they did a few years ago. And what we heard in our interviews is that funders engaged in more collaborative practices during the pandemic, and where they have had a positive experience of collaboration, they're keen to sustain this way of working. There's also appetite to pooled funding on issues that funders would like to address, but that are perceived as new, difficult, or perhaps risky. And by grouping together, funders can share risk and strategize together. Also, over recent years, many more funders have been asking themselves questions about their own power and legitimacy. And that has prompted funders to explore avenues to fund more equitably and in a way that is participatory, involving the communities that they want to serve, and which can again be an area where collaborating and pooling can help with. And then finally, and this is something we definitely heard, is due to this growing sense of all-consuming crises, whether that's COVID, whether that's climate change, or the cost of living crisis, funders are increasingly realizing that even as a big funder, you cannot even begin to solve these issues alone, and need to work with others to achieve large systemic shifts. So a big part of our research is that we explored the opportunities and challenges that are inherent in the pooled funding model. We deliberately wanted to produce a balanced piece of work. We don't think pooled funds are sort of a panacea. They are a really interesting approach of funding, but they have, inherent opportunities. They also have challenges in this model. And so that was a question that we explored with the funders we spoke with the people that were running pooled funds, as well as with grantees. And we cover this in some depth in the research, but today we only have limited time. So we're just going to do a quick top level run through of those. And I will hand over to Alice to talk through the opportunities. So if we could please have the next slide.
Thank you. So we heard so much from our interviewees about the opportunities and the real value of pooled funds models. We've split here the reflections into the thoughts from funders and funder intermediaries on the one hand, and from grantees that we spoke to on the other. In terms of the value for funders and funder intermediaries, We heard a lot about how pooled funds offer an opportunity to operate more strategically, so they can really help to amplify a cause and maximize the value of the investment that's being made. They also allow funders to entertain a degree of risk, and I think this is a really interesting area where of the value of a pooled fund, which is the ability to be able to collaborate with other funders and to share that risk together. We heard about people saying that they felt that they were more than the sum of their parts by being involved in a pooled fund, and that it was an opportunity to test the waters. We heard from many of our interviewees that the value of pooled funds is being able to experiment, to act with flexibility and agility. So some pooled funds use participatory grant-making practices or fund longer terms, for example, which allows funders to sort of see what that looks like in practice. And one of our interviewees described pooled funds as a rich learning space. They really provide an opportunity to do a deep dive into a particular issue, to be able to explore and test it more. And pooled funds can help to build up the infrastructure in areas that require development, and can really open up new pipelines of work. In terms of the grantees, we heard they stressed the value of being able to develop a trusted relationship with a pooled fund that's closer to the work and more in tune with the landscape and the context. And pooled funds are also often open to experimentation and will seek to ensure that application processes are really light touch. We also heard about pooled funds creating simpler and more streamlined grants management and reporting processes, which many grantees really valued. And the act of bringing together a group of funders in a pooled fund can help grantees to become known to a broader range of trusts and foundations, which allows grantees to be able to build up relationships with other funders. Pooled funds can also be powerful to raise the salience of an issue area and to offer and often can offer longer term commitment because they're unlikely to chop and change their strategy. And it allows the development of field infrastructure. This was really valued. So being part of a cohort, being able to learn with others and finding opportunities for collaboration. That was a whistle stop, but you can read more about that in the report. And if we can move to the next slide, Lena will talk through some of the challenges.
Right, so we have the same format here. On the one hand, we have the challenges that were raised by funders and by those that are running funder intermediaries, and the other side shows what we heard from grantees receiving funding from pooled funds. The first one is really the big one, which is the challenge around sharing power, which is why we call the research its name, and also relinquishing control, which is a key feature of agreeing to pooled funds, but is still a challenge for many funders and especially for many trustee boards. A second area, which we've heard a lot about from pooled funds themselves, is this need to secure sufficient resources to actually deliver the mission of a pooled fund. In order to do that, in order to create the full value, the fund needs to be resourced accordingly. That requires the ability to make multi-year grants, to cover appropriate overheads, to offer field building support, and to really deliver the benefits of that model. Linked to this point is to really have those funds over a certain time frame, and to have security to have that can be a real challenge. And it can mean that pooled funds engage in sort of sometimes less than ideal funding practices because not having that secure funding. And I think the constant pressure to fundraise is perhaps the top challenge that we've heard from people running pooled funds. There are also operational challenges just around running quite a complex setup with lots of different stakeholders. I think pooled funds aren't just difficult to get off the ground, they're also quite difficult to maintain. They face a lot of different ways. And the last one is a challenge just around demonstrating sufficient value add to both field and funders. A pooled fund really sits in the middle. It effectively takes up a position between the funder and the field. And so it looks both ways, which means it needs to demonstrate value to both the funder supporting it as well as to the field that it is trying to fund. And then what we heard from grantees on the other side is that there can be challenges around funding limitations. Those linked to this difficulty of resourcing. So if a pooled fund is insufficiently resourced or only resourced over the short term, there's a risk that its grants may limit the grantee's ability to flourish. One-off small grants are very rarely what organizations need to grow and to build their work. A second challenge we heard is around sort of perpetuating traditional models. Pooled funds often position themselves as sort of a different way of funding, and it's really important then that they are able to kind of follow that through with their funding processes, with the quality of interactions they have with grantees, because if they're not doing that, they sort of can easily lose credibility with the field. There's a recognition, I think, among grantees that overstretch is a challenge for pooled funds, and the pressures of fundraising, of delivering, of managing multiple stakeholders, and also keeping overheads low, which is often demanded by funders, can create a real stretch on pooled fund capacity. When a pooled fund sort of gets its positioning slightly wrong, there can be a sort of a perception that that pooled funds increase competition, and it could potentially leave a field as less well resourced and more competitive. So I think managing that positioning is really, really important. And then finally, we heard from grantees around sort of the raising of expectations. I think a new pooled fund in an area will always raise expectations, even with very light touch application processes and very valuable feedback. Some organizations will inevitably miss out. And that means expectations need to be carefully managed and communicated. Again, that's really top level. We have a lot more detail and interesting quotes as well in the research. So hopefully that'll be one to check out after we're done today. I'll now hand back to Alice to talk us through some of the key ingredients a pooled fund should have. Oh, sorry, if we could switch. Yeah, next slide.
Can we move to the next slide? Lovely. So I think it's really important to say that pooled funds are really complex and really individual. So they're going to be highly context dependent and will typically respond to a particular situation or question. So it's unlikely that one fund will look exactly the same as another. But nevertheless, as part of this research, we really wanted to try and distill what this sort of question of what does it take for a pooled fund to be effective. And so we asked all the interviewees to name the key ingredients that they thought were needed to make a pooled fund effective. And the answers were really rich and wide-ranging. But then we did hear really quite a significant level of convergence. And so we wanted to put together this tool that we hope will be helpful to be able to articulate the key elements. So this diagram summarizes these key ingredients grouped into 6 categories: strategy, resources, structure, leadership, values, and context. So of course, not every pooled fund will tick every single box to the same extent, and the context in particular will really dictate the differences. But we do believe that in order to effectively deliver a pooled fund in the long term, these key ingredients are really fundamental. And we do hope that this tool can be useful to funders in deciding whether to invest in or even to initiate a pooled fund and to pooled funds themselves. So as part of the research, we actually applied this tool to the Civic Power Fund to demonstrate its use. And we're really delighted that Martha is going to be joining us today to be able to share more about their work. I'm going to pass back to Lena to talk a little bit more about the guiding questions that we put together as well. Can we have the next slide as well?
Thank you. So what we've already heard is that strong and long-term funder commitment is crucial for pooled funds to realize their potential and to overcome many of the challenges that are inherent in this model. But reluctance among funders, especially trustee boards, to seek control, as well as perhaps a lack of understanding of the pooled fund model, are key barriers to funders contributing to pooled funds. Sort of looking at that conundrum, we thought it could perhaps be helpful to create a practical tool to provide funders, staff, and trustees with a set of guiding questions to aid their thinking and their decision making about whether to initiate or to invest in a pooled fund. We've got the 5 overarching questions on this slide, but in the research, there is sort of a set of sub-questions underneath each of them. And we really think it's sort of a bit of a decision tree model. So we would urge funders that are interested in that space just to try to work through them. And we'll again talk through them now at a high level. So the first and perhaps really obvious question, but we think important to ask, is can you solve the issue you are seeking to address by yourself? In some cases, the answer is probably yes. Funders are perhaps well placed to fund directly. Perhaps there is a niche to fill, a specialism that a funder has honed over many years, and staff and trustees will have developed exceptional competence in a particular issue area or change methodology. But many of the challenges we're facing today are really complex, they're intersectional, they're deep-rooted, and they're structural. And that means they'll require long-term concerted efforts and focus, and something a single funder often can not achieve alone. And we think that in these instances, a collective response can be the good option. It means you can take riskier bets, you can trial innovative new models, you can invest in thought leadership and shared learning, and that may lead to greater impact. And taking collective response also may, of course, raise additional funding towards the cause, and bring significant leverage to what a single funder cannot achieve on its own. So if you move on, and if the answer to the first question is no, then you move on to question 2, which is pooled funding the right vehicle? Because it doesn't necessarily mean that pooled fund is the right answer. In some cases, a looser collaboration or an aligned funding model could be a much more straightforward and cost-effective alternative. We asked a little bit during our interviews around where people thought pooled funds work particularly well, and we had a range of responses, but we thought there are examples really of current live pooled funds which demonstrate areas where this pooled funding model works. One is around a coordinated emergency response during the pandemic, so a crisis response where resources need to be mobilized quickly. Another is sort of a specific, well-defined strategic aim. And we thought the Democracy Fund, the UK Democracy Fund, was a good example here, as it wants to increase electoral participation of the underrepresented groups in the UK and is very targeted on that. Another area is sharing learning and or risk in a new area. And we've seen that with the Power of Pop Fund, which is pioneering a new approach to pop culture for social justice. And also where a concerted power shift is needed. And I think examples here would be the Civic Power Fund, but also the Baumgartner Foundation. I'll hand over to Alice for question 3 and onwards.
Great, so moving down the decision tree, our next question was, is this the right pooled fund? And so if pooled funding is deemed to be the answer, the question that then becomes sort of what is the right type of pooled fund? And we ask this because the right host, the right setup, the right leadership are really paramount for its success. It's obviously sort of too simplistic to say that a pooled fund is either a good or a bad model, because too much will sort of really depend on the fund itself, its guiding purpose and its context. But we produced the key ingredients tool that I referred to earlier as a tool to be able to draw out what makes a pooled, what actually really makes a pooled fund particularly effective. And so at this juncture, I think it's worth asking, going back to that tool and really reflecting on whether or not the fund actually meets those criteria. So then the next question, are you ready to shift power to a pooled fund? And in some respect, this can sort of feel like the most important question of all. And during our research and speaking to funders and intermediaries and grantees, particularly grantees who'd received funding both from non-pooled and from pooled funds, we heard a lot of enthusiasm for these kinds of models. But we also heard that there's a real reticence about investing in these vehicles, particularly from trustee boards, who I think understandably can be wary about transferring funds into a pool where this also involves passing on the power to make those funding decisions. So this question is really important. We need funders and trustee boards to really work through the risk of letting go of some of their power, balanced with the potential for the wider impact that pooled funding models hold. So as part of this, we do really encourage trustees to consider what elements of their approach and decision-making processes would they be willing to let go of or to compromise on. And then the final question, can you maintain the commitment in the long term? We felt this was really important to end on, because pooled funds are caught in the middle, right? Like they're acting as both grant seekers and grant givers. And this brings a closeness to the field, a really unique perspective and an understanding of what it means to be seeking funding in what is quite a challenging environment. But it also means that pooled funds experience the same sorts of precarities of other grantees in being able to set long-term strategies, employ staff, and provide stability to the sector that they're looking to sustain. And this really underlines the vital need for pooled funds to be resourced for the long term. And funders need to decide whether funders that are deciding whether to invest in a pooled fund really need to consider whether they're ready for this. I think there is a risk that investing in a pooled fund only to then withdraw shortly after could end up toppling the whole endeavour. And so trustees and funder power brokers really need to be mindful of this when taking the plunge into a pooled fund. So I'm just going to pass on to Lena to talk a little bit more about where next. We have our next slide, please.
Yeah, and these are just briefly some of our closing reflections. I think where Alice and I left off was that we're both enthusiastic about the value and potential of pooled fund models, and we heard that a lot in our research as well. I think pooled funds enable funders to be strategic, to be more equitable, and obviously collaborative. They also hold opportunities for thought leadership, for innovative funding practices and experimentation, for shifting power and perhaps operating in a more participatory way, for closeness, greater closeness to the work. And we think all that holds high merit, and in fact is something that the sector, the charity sector, the funder sector really urgently needs more of. But they're also not a one-size-fits-all. They're also not necessarily the answer, because there are inherent challenges in this model. There are challenges in setting up and maintaining pooled funds. As we heard, many of them are linked to the resourcing and to the inadequate resourcing over the long term. And fundamentally about many of the funders still being reluctant to kind of cede some power and control over a share of their funding. So where we leave, what's next really is that we think for pooled funds to really go mainstream and to channel more funding, we will need to see a mindset shift and a deeper reckoning around power from more funders. We really hope that our research and some of the sort of more practical elements in it can play a role in that to make that happen, and really look forward to kind of engaging more with funders on this question going forward. So we really wanted to thank you all for listening and hopefully engaging with the research, and holding back to you, Alice, one more time.
Lovely. So we're now pleased to hand over to Holly Donner, who's the Director of Strategic Learning, Insight and Influence at Paul Hamlyn Foundation, to share her reflections as a funder who has invested in and also championed multiple pooled funds. And then afterwards, we'll hear from Martha Mackenzie, Director of the Civic Power Fund, which is the pooled fund that we refer to as a case study in our report. So Holly, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Alice. It's really great to be with you this morning, talking about this really interesting and important subject. I've been at Paul Hamlyn Foundation for about 4 years, and in that time I've been fairly involved in a few of the pooled funds that are mentioned in the report. So the Power Pop Collaborative, Civic Power Fund, UK Democracy Fund. And as Alice said, we're also a major funder in a number of other pooled funds, so Baobab, the Justice Together initiative, which focuses on immigration advice space, and kind of connected but different, we contribute to Islington Giving and Camden Giving, so who are doing that kind of micro participatory grant making. And we've made some significant contributions to those big emergency pooled funds that we've also referenced. And there are other examples. So I'd say that as a funder, we're quite comfortable with the idea of pooled funds, but we do absolutely look at each initiative on its own merits, and those points about context are really important, I think. So we're fairly kind of mode agnostic, I would say. Just because something is a pooled fund doesn't necessarily mean we like it more, but I think that in itself is quite an interesting conversation. I think 2 of the kind of through lines for us, and these are both kind of mentioned in the report, but they're very important and sort of why we've wanted to be involved in pooled funds, is firstly, absolutely that piece about those big picture themes that affect the sector as a whole. So things like democracy, the emerging narrative change space, these are really critical to all the sectors we invest in, but they don't sit easily into our funding strategy and our priority areas. We're quite a large funder, relatively speaking. We spend about 35 to 40 million pounds a year in grants. Most of that grant making goes through open funds, responsive open funds, so in the arts, migration, youth space. So kind of addressing these big strategic picture issues is always kind of functionally quite difficult for us, and the pooled funds kind of offer that opportunity. So that's been really important. The responsiveness as well. That point about UK Democracy Fund is a really good example of that. It's something that we, wanted to be part of, but I don't know how else we would have managed to be as agile unless that kind of pooled fund opportunity had come up. The other sort of really practical thing is really kind of recognizing where we're not the right people. We don't have the networks, we don't have the relationships, and it's a lot more straightforward and pragmatic for us to contribute to something where those relationships are in place. So for a few of these initiatives, that's been a real driver for us. I think more strategically, one of the most important things has been that point about the learning journey. I've been really pleased to be involved in the Power of Pop collaborative, and we wanted to be part of that because we saw that opportunity for learning about a field that I don't think that we're very interested in internally and connects with lots of our funding areas, but that we didn't feel we had that knowledge. And I think that, investing in that fund, being able to be on that learning journey with those organisations and funders is really powerful. And it's helping us understand the ecosystem. It's helping us do that trend analysis. And we're always thinking, what does this mean for Paul Hamlyn Foundation and everything we're doing? So that opportunity to be having a learning initiative alongside our main work is super interesting. And I think very different to, commissioning research or being part of a kind of more singularly thought leadership type initiative, because you're also learning from the kind of grassroots and the ground up. So for all those reasons, I think we're very sort of positive about this form of collaboration. Helps us expand our reach, helps us think about what we need to be doing, also expands our impact. Some of the kind of results of this work are really extraordinary and we shouldn't underestimate it. So being able to kind of, for want of a better expression, own some of that impact through our investment is very, very important to us and our trustees. I think the challenges for us going forward, and we've already talked about it, is we're relatively large, so we're able to kind of take some of these opportunities and do it in addition to our main grant making. What happens when we start to say this is our main grant making? This is a much bigger proportion of what we do as an organisation. And then those questions about competition, choosing one thing, not another thing, those questions about the role of us as grant makers, but also our trustees, and all of those kind of questions become much, much more salient when it becomes a much more mainstream piece. So I'm really thoughtful about this, and the research is going to help us think about that into the future. I think there is a real risk if we don't do that thinking, that as a funder, you are outsourcing risk and simply perpetuating existing kind of models and kind of leaving it to somebody else to maybe grapple with big, complex questions. And ideally, we want to be thinking much more strategically about what those things mean for us as funders as a whole. So that kind of shift, I think, from a kind of pragmatic response to, oh, yes, we want to be part of that, we can see it's useful, to a strategic response, I think is the next thing we need to think about. And that's going to be a challenge, not just around the process of pooled funding, but how do we do strategy as a sector together? How do funders do strategy? It's not a straightforward question, but it's a very important one. And I'll just finish by saying, I think, when we look to the future, when we think about climate change, when we think about the future of democracy, when we think about the future of human rights, these big picture questions, we have to get around the table and talk about these things. And I think this conversation is a really interesting way in, and there are absolutely others that we need to take as well. I'll stop there.
Amazing. Thank you, Holly. Over to you, Martha.
Thank you so much. So just a brief introduction from me. So you've already heard I'm the director of the Civic Power Fund. We are a new independent pooled fund specifically for grassroots community organising. And by independent, I mean that we don't have any funders on our board or involved in governance. We're governed entirely by movement builders. And we currently work with around 40 grantee partners. So these are organisations ranging from really kind of hyper-local to working right across the UK. But the thing they have in common is that community organising is their core business. And we provide funding and key wraparound support to those partners. And we're also currently working with about 20 funders who are working with us to pool and then shift resources into this work at scale. And really, we have a dual mandate as a fund. So we're deeply concerned about democracy and challenging democratic decline across the UK. But we're also very clearly aiming to build the power of oppressed communities to win change that matters to them and secure justice. And we do that by investing in organising, because we've seen time and time again that community organising is incredibly effective at building durable local and national change, really boosting the power and agency of communities. And then through its deep relational work, strengthening those communities and really strengthening our society as a whole. And I'm going to use my time to just pull out 4 of the lessons that Lena and Alice have talked to us today about and put it in context of what we've been trying to do at the Civic Power Fund. We're about 2.5 years old, so a lot of this learning is quite fresh, and we're very much iterating as we go. The first one I wanted to touch upon is this sense of kind of pooled funds being able to do that deep relational work with grantee partners that large funders can't always do, or actually it might not even be strategic for them to do. That's something we've tried to internalise at the Civic Power Fund. We're governed by movement builders and we're staffed by organisers and people with organising experience. And last year we ran a completely open, democratic, participatory fund to find and fund grassroots organising work that's happening across the UK. We had about 900 potentially in-scope applications, which really blew us away. We weren't expecting that. And we worked as a staff team to whittle that down to a short list of 89 groups. And we then worked on a one-to-one basis with each of those 89 groups to create a grant memo that captured their work and what they were hoping to do. And through that process, we really got to know the groups, but we also created something that they could leave the process with that would support their strategy and their future fundraising. We then worked with a panel of community organisers to run a participatory process to select the final organisations that we could fund. So we ran an open recruitment for that panel, and those 7 community organisers designed the selection criteria and then made the final selection. And in the end, they picked 18 amazing organisations. And I think the first thing to say is that through that process, we got to know those partners one-on-one and really understand them. But we also saw the deep care and deliberation that came through organisers making those decisions. And that really for us led to better outcomes, better field building, and a better understanding of the work. And what's been so exciting for us is that we're coming to the end of those grants. It's been about a year since that funding was awarded. And so we've been doing grant calls with those partners and really learning about how catalytic that investment was for them. Whereas before, most of those organisations would really have struggled to access philanthropic resource. Now they've been able to really turn that into kind of serious fundraising and serious impact. So someone like Parents for Future Scotland, they were barely an organisation. We were their first funder. In a year, they've become a registered charity. They've raised a further kind of 160 grand, and they've been able to mobilise around 40 different schools to campaign very effectively around air pollution in Glasgow. Similarly, the Common Good Foundation in Grimsby, they've been kind of working quietly behind the scenes to train up 40 leaders across their town who started off winning small victories around things like zebra crossings, but are already now coming together to challenge the council on youth mental health services. And we're hearing from them that funding that they would have struggled to otherwise access has been really catalytic, as well as the wraparound support. And what I want to touch upon very briefly there is obviously you'll have heard some kind of quite stark ratios, so 900 to 89 to 18. But I think because of the care and the deep knowledge that we were able to bring to that process, we had very positive feedback. And so 70% of first stage applicants rated their experience as good as very good, and 100% of second stage applicants told us the same. So being able to kind of do that deep, wide work, but then work on a very specialist basis, created a much more equitable and enjoyable experience for all, or at least that's what we learned. I'm going to touch on the 3 other lessons with a little bit more speed. So the second one, we talked a bit about risk absorption in funding this work. There's a whole other conversation to be had about what do we mean by risk that I'm not going to go into now, but I think this has definitely been our experience. And it's fair to say that in funding organising and in pooling resources, we're asking a lot of funders and a lot of trustee boards to do something that's outside of their comfort zone and outside of usual kind of cultural practice. By being an intermediary funder, we're a registered charity. We can come and we can both bring funders together to take on that risk together, but also sort of minimize the stress and encourage funders to move more quickly because we're able to take some of that on ourselves. And one of the ways that we manage that is that we work, as I've already said, on a very sort of one-to-one basis with our grantee partners. So even though we're mainly funding non-charities, we get to know them and know their work really deeply so that we're very confident when we go through that due diligence process. But we also have an in-house governance hub that supports those partners to strengthen their own governance when there are challenges, but also is just there to ask key questions about charitable spending and about what they can and can't do in this space. The third area is around long-term field building. And I think that's definitely something that we're starting to see emerging through the Civic Power Fund. Partly that is because some of the connections that we can make through our grantee partners. So these are organisations that were working at a local level doing amazing work, but by being able to sustain them financially and provide wraparound support, they're both scaling locally, but they're working together to scale nationally. And one example is we support an amazing women's organisation in Stretford in Manchester. They've been doing incredible hyperlocal work, but they want to get access to some bigger training and some more national impact. We've been able to connect them to one of our national partners that runs chapter-based training and sort of deep work around gender justice, love and power. But similarly, because we're movement facing and we're kind of organiser facing, getting the feedback from the groups we fund about what they need and the infrastructure that would boost them is something we can then take back to our funders, and we do that on a regular basis. And then the final area I just wanted to touch on is strategic collaboration. I think just by working with 20 funders, we can start to sort of shift practice at scale and start to pool resources for more impact. And we've already been able to see that a little bit through some of the projects that we're now taking on around building a new alliance for youth organising, but also pooling funders to invest specifically in a really sort of deep, long-term way around building migrant power and the power of diaspora communities. What has been really crucial to all of those 4 areas for us is a commitment to learn in public. I've said already, we're only about 2.5 years old. There's a need for kind of deep accountability and deep transparency in this work. And so by learning aloud and sharing our lessons as we go, we're trying very much to kind of deliver for the field, but also deliver that learning and deliver that strategic practice for funders. And I should say what's been really critical for us is that our long-term goal is not to grow in perpetuity. Our long-term goal is to shift much more power and much more resource into grassroots community organising. And right now we hope to be able to do that through us as a pooled fund, but in time it may be that we can influence funders or bring others into this space in a way that actually moves money at scale. I'm going to finish very briefly by just picking up on some of the challenges. Again, we've heard some of these from Lena and Alice, and there were a few that I just wanted to reinforce. It should be very transparent that sort of that risk absorption piece, but also doing deep anti-oppression focused work, it needs investment. And I think we need to be more honest about when we're creating independent pooled funds, there is a need for serious investment in the infrastructure, and we need to think a bit differently about overheads as a result. And that's definitely something we found, and being more honest about the need to really sort of resource this back end and do that deep work long term has been key for us. There's also just a real genuine challenge in relationship management. I mentioned already we have 20 separate funders. We also work with 40 grantee partners, but relationships are key to everything we do. So actually having the staff, the energy, the time to manage those relationships can be a real challenge. And we need to be thinking more creatively as a fund around sharing and reporting, building relationships as a whole, rather than having those relationships as individuals. And then the final area I just wanted to touch on is ensuring that we're both agile and robust. So we're deliberately very small. We have a staff team of about 3.6 FTE because our goal is to get the vast majority of the resource that we bring in back out the door. But being really robust as an independent charity that's managing a lot of money does require that back-end investment. So how do we get the balance right between being very agile and field focused and just making sure that we make those investments? But I know we want to have enough time for questions and conversation. So I'm going to stop there. Very happy to share more on the Civic Power Fund and our model. And just huge thanks to everyone who's been involved in this research. It's been a real joy to see it emerge and see so much conversation around pooled funds.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to everybody here for sharing their reflections. being so open and honest and candid, and also for the resource findings and the toolkit. We are getting lots of questions here, so let's start straight away. So for me, there's questions around collaboration and learning. So one of the questions come up is, what kind of learning infrastructure within pooled funds enables funders who are contributing to better social change? And I don't know if Alice or Lena want to take that first.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to reflect a little bit on thoughts from the Power of POP Fund. So we've really embedded learning into the Power of POP Fund right from the start. We have a learning coordinator. We've been having regular learning sessions where we bring together the grantees and the funder partners to learn from one another, to share, to collaborate, to connect. And that sort of, that I think it really helps to show the distinctive nature of a pooled fund, because obviously funders can fund lots of different organizations, but they don't necessarily do that active piece of work to actually bring them all together. And sometimes just being in the same room can then lead to greater collaboration, greater connection, iteration, and that opportunity for that shared learning. I think also being part of a cohort, there's a real sort of sense of being a cohort of other within a cohort of other organizations, can really add to the learning and the donor learning journey. So this is something that Holly referred to. I think for funders that are embarking on a new investment into a pooled fund, these kind of learning opportunities are really valuable. I know as well the Civic Power Fund does a lot of thought leadership, a lot of articles and learning that help to really bring funders along on that journey. I'll pass over to Lena in case she has any additions.
Yeah, thank you. Not much to add other than perhaps to say that I mean, in my experience also, I think learning is really central to the pooled funds that I've had experience of, and it's really be seen as part of the role to kind of grow knowledge of the particular area and ideally bring in more funders into this particular field. Again, with the UK Democracy Fund, I think it's very much part of the fund's role. But I would also say that I think it's really funder dependent. And I think some funders are really keen to engage in that learning piece and make the time to engage in it. And that's something they want to get out of the pooled fund. And others perhaps less so because they just see it as an important area to invest in, but perhaps don't have the bandwidth to do that. And I think that's sort of also okay. Like, I think there are sort of different ways of engaging in a pooled fund and engaging with that learning. But it's my experience too that the learning is absolutely central to that work. But I think perhaps, yeah, Holly or Martha want to come in on that too.
I just add very briefly, one of the things that we're trying to do is how do we kind of shift our expectations of learning. So perhaps it's less about kind of really specific funder-driven objectives, but understanding kind of what type of investment really enhances this work and how do we fund better to support the work and support the organisations to do their best work. And we've been trying to put in place right since the beginning a learning framework that was co-written by community organisers, so that in every place that we put that learning framework in, we're bringing community organisers in to co-design it, so that when they're reporting on what they found or their experience of the resource or the experience of the investment that works, it's plugged into their objectives and the things that they know will work. So I think some of those shifts about how we think about learning is key to this too.
The only thing I might add is I think it's really important when we're thinking about pooled funds that it's about what funding kind of sticks to the edges and doesn't go straight through to beneficiaries and grantees and beneficiaries, and actually really thinking carefully about getting that bit of the resourcing right, and I would say fairly substantial, because I think sometimes that's not thought about enough up front, and it really makes the difference, I think, between a strategic and sustainable, meaningful intervention over time and a more sort of urgent, pragmatic, it's a thing and we've done it, and learning's obviously crucial to that. Brilliant,
thank you. There's also a set of questions around power, and especially shifting power to the front line. It'd be really good to hear a bit more from Martha and Holly in terms of how you did that to make sure equity and inclusivity is at the heart of shifting power and decision making when you're doing your pooled funds.
I'd just say two very quick reflections on that. One is that we made a decision to do quite a lot of participatory processes and learn a lot from the participatory grant givers movement and others around that, just in terms of if we were serious about shifting this resource and really being field led, we wanted to make sure that was embedded through all our practice. And so you heard about that in the Community Action Fund. And that's also been really key around the Alliance for Youth Organising that we're building at the moment. So I think that kind of very deliberate decision to do the shifting of resource through participatory processes has been absolutely critical. But also I think for us, it's been about the transparency as well. And so, for example, like when we've been investing or if we've been doing kind of re-granting on behalf of funders, if there isn't enough resource or there isn't the kind of the right resource and the right flexibility in a way that's actually going to work for the communities that we're investing in, it's incumbent on us to reflect that back and be really honest to funders and share those experiences and share those concerns, so that we're not just acting as that gatekeeper intermediary. We're actually making sure that we're breaking down those barriers and making sure that funders hear directly from the work and what is needed. But super happy to go into that in more depth, but I'll stop there for now.
Brilliant.
I mean, the only thing I would say is, you know, something like our participation in the Civic Power Fund offers us an opportunity to learn from what they're doing and to understand what this looks like in practice. And over time, I think that will influence how we fund as an organisation. But, you know, it gives us that bandwidth to do things differently rather than kind of having to change everything at PHF first, if you see what I mean. So it's a really great sort of move for us into greater shifting of power and greater equity. But it's not, you know, it's obviously not the whole way at the moment.
Thank you. I have a couple of practical questions here, and one of them maybe Alice and Lena can take over, is once pooled fund has been developed, what is the level of engagement or oversight from the funder? Is there a good practice here?
Happy to kick us off on that. I mean, I think it really depends. I think pooled fund models are, you know, are different, are complex, and there's different setups. I think there are setups where funders are involved in a steering capacity or in perhaps a funders group. And there are setups where funders are really quite deliberately not very much involved beyond the initial donations and sort of really kind of let go. I think there's always the ability to be part of the learning. But I think part of the pooled funding is for funders to kind of step back and to let pooled funds get on with the work as much as possible. I think there absolutely will be often input to advise, to share experiences, to learn, to exchange, to get to know and to be part of a group. But I think that the key piece is really around kind of shifting that power on the decision making.
Yeah, I think it can, as Lena said, it can really vary. I think there is something about the value of being able to, for the funder to be able to pass the responsibility to the pooled fund to be able to do all of the kind of the governance and the engagement with the grantees. And so that's all being held. And then that means that the funder doesn't have to be, the grantee doesn't have to report back to multiple different funders who have perhaps different requirements and things. So that ability to contain that is I think really valuable too.
Thank you. We're getting lots of questions in, so clearly this is a topic that people want to talk about, and we're almost running out of time. But I do want to ask a question myself, which is, you've been in this sector for a while now, everyone. Is there anything here that surprised you from the study? What's the thing that you'll take away? Lena, Alice, Holly, Martha, jump in.
I'll happily start. I think I guess what surprised me still is that sort of in 2024, with these really big global systemic challenges that we're all facing, that there is sort of still quite a lot of work to do in terms of this need to kind of this sort of requirement to come together and to seed power in order to kind of achieve a greater impact. And I think sort of some of the barriers we heard about, whether they be overheads or inadequate resourcing, I just feel that, I guess I'm still surprised that there's still quite a way to go to achieve that. I'm also heartened by the fact that we've had such a great interest in this piece of work. So I think there's part of me that is very optimistic and which thinks, you know, there really is appetite for learning more about this and understanding this quite complex model further.
Yeah, I mean, I think I share very similar reflections to Lena. You know, we need to collaborate more. We need to work together in order to face complex problems, and these kind of models really allow for that. And I think in what's quite interesting is that funders will often invest their money in order to get a return on that, and they'll take some risks with that, as any investment portfolio would. And so I think there's something similar in this kind of work around taking a risk in terms of the kind of investments that you're going to make to grantees. And so I guess it still does surprise me that some funders won't fund pooled funds because they don't like the idea of the riskiness of them. And yet, given the challenges we face, perhaps that's what's needed, is to engage in a bit more risk sometimes, in a measured way. It doesn't all have to be in the kind of risky bucket, but we can still balance it. Yeah, I'll pass over to Holly and Martha.
Really quickly, I think connection, collaboration, these are very sort of central values for us, and therefore we're kind of minded to be part of this story and this journey. And in some ways, I think what the report's done for me is making me think about how do we not just respond to some of these opportunities as they come up, but think more long-term and strategically about this alongside other modes of action as a way of really committing to our role in addressing some of these big picture challenges. So I think it's an incredibly sort of helpful lever to have that conversation. But I think the conversation, in a sense, is not simply about a mode of funding. It's about a much bigger kind of set of questions about how we show up as a sector and what does that mean for us.
Yeah, finally, Martha.
I would say that not very much surprised me about the research, having lived it for the last couple of years, but I'm fairly new to the funding world. I started my own career in community organising, and then have worked in social change at both a local but also right up to the United Nations level. And I think for me, going into building the Civic Power Fund, I went in an absolute evangelist for organising as a practice. But in spending time in this community and building this network of funders and organisers and partners, I'm coming out an evangelist for pooled funding, and really being able to kind of see the impact of the work and the potential here to really shift power and have a proper impact at scale. So I think that's been a surprise for me, just to see how effective I think this model has the potential to be, notwithstanding all of the challenges that we've discussed that are very, very real. Brilliant,
thank you. And I'm going to give my answer to this chair's prerogative, which is, we know this is difficult, and we've known it for some time. And what I found quite interesting is that we didn't have any tools or resources to have that conversation. And actually, it's how do you open up this conversation? We're not saying either or. We're saying we need a number of ways to fund where big issues are taking place, and how do we funders actually do that, and help support the wider sector. So for me, it's always a question of what is it that we could do together that is practical, but where are the tools to help us do that? So if there are good examples around, please do share it wider in the sector. And I'm gone beyond our time, but I just want to say thank you to everybody on the panel, and thank you to people coming to this event today. The questions you've asked are absolutely brilliant, and hopefully we will continue to have this conversation. And if those of you who have done some great work here, please do get in touch. We would love to continue to talk to you. Thank you, everyone.